I saw her freeze. My eyes wide, my lips still parted waiting for the kiss that never came, my hand suspended in the air as if it could stop me from finishing. But there was no going back. I knew. I knew everything. Every message sent, every look exchanged, every lame excuse to leave early or arrive later, every time his name was mentioned with such disgusting naturalness that it made me choke. I knew they laughed at me while I slept next to her, while I believed in that act of a loving woman who was waiting for me with a hot dish and a warm kiss on the forehead. I knew because I saw it. Because I read it. Because I heard. I didn't imagine. I was sure. And now, standing before her, breathing shallow, my chest burning with an inexplicable pain, I said. I want a divorce. I know everything about you and your lover. And everyone will know too. She didn't say a word. Not one. The color drained from his face. The fingers began to tremble. And I felt relief. A sickening relief, it's true. But a relief. For weeks, I rehearsed this moment. For nights, I imagined what it would be like to watch her world fall apart as she destroyed mine. Because it wasn't just the marriage that she killed. It was my self-esteem, my sanity, my pride as a man. For 2 years, I carried on my shoulders a home that no longer existed. I was faithful to the ghost of a wife. I humiliated myself trying to rekindle something she already buried with each muffled moan on another mattress. The problem was that she thought I was stupid. That I would never notice. That I would never have the courage. And she was right, until she wasn't. It all started when I noticed small details. The new perfume that didn't suit her. The way she dressed for work, too smart for a Tuesday. The laughter on the cell phone that ended as soon as I entered the room. The 2 long showers, the last-minute trips, the empty excuses. At first, I wanted to deny it. I wanted to believe it was just in my head. That the routine was wearing us down. I tried to be more present, more kind, more passionate. I bought flowers. I cooked. I booked trips. But she was distant. Cold. Away. And one day, while I was organizing office documents, I found the proof. A bank statement, a hotel receipt, 2 names in the same room. I still wanted to believe there was an explanation. Idiot. Naive. I went to the place. I talked to the receptionist. I showed her photo. He confirmed with a smile that ripped me apart, ah yes, the usual couple. That's when everything inside me started to die. The love. The patience. The fear. I planned. I watched. I gathered evidence. I recorded conversations. I made each of their meetings an archive. I didn't just want to leave. I wanted her to taste what she did to me. And then I discovered something else. Something that turned my hurt into fury. Her lover, he wasn't just a cheater. He was a criminal disguised as a successful businessman. I cross-referenced information. I reviewed the past. I used contacts she didn't even know I had. And I discovered a money laundering scheme. I found out she was part of it. Without knowing. But it did. The deposits she thought were gifts were actually camouflage transfers. Her studio. A facade. The exhibitions. Pure wash. She thought she was loved. It was being used. And when I realized this, a part of me felt sorry. But another, the most wounded, rawest part, smiled. I could have just turned everything over to the police. But no. Not yet. First, she needed to know that I knew. That he was no longer the fool in love. That now I was the one in control. I waited for the right moment. A dinner between friends. A forced celebration. And in the middle of the toasts, when she tried to kiss me, I smiled coldly. I backed away. And he said. Not angry. But with the surgical precision of someone who wants to leave scars. She froze. The friends were silent. And silence screamed louder than any accusation. That night, I slept on the couch. Not for lack of bed. But because her presence made me feel nauseous. In the morning, she tried to talk. He cried. He begged. Denied. But I showed it. The photos. The audios. The receipts. She fell to her knees. And I just looked. There was no woman there anymore. Just a shadow of who I once swore to love. And then came the bomb. The lover had been arrested. The police knocked on the door. They confiscated equipment. They took documents. And she, desperate, looked at me as if I were her last refuge. But I just said, "I'm not your husband anymore. I'm the witness." While she was being questioned, I walked through the streets with a strange lightness. The world seemed clearer. Fairer. For the first time in a long time, I breathed without tasting deceit. News of the arrest spread. The scandal fell on her like an avalanche. The press exposed it. Her reputation, built on paint and varnish, dissolved in the mud of truth. Friends disappeared. Invitations were cancelled. Customers gave up. And me? I watched in silence. Not with joy. But with the serenity of someone who finally had justice. The most ironic? She still loves me. Or think you love. Write me letters. Ask for forgiveness. She says she was manipulated. That I didn't know. That everything was a mistake. But the mistake was not cheating. The mistake was thinking that I would never be caught. And more than that, thinking that I would accept living as a supporting character in my own life. Now, she is alone. And I found someone. Someone who didn't arrive to erase scars, but to show that it was still possible to live without pain. Someone who listened to me. Who didn't look at me as a survivor, but as a whole man. And in this new beginning, I learned that betrayal is not the end. It's the beginning. The beginning of a new story, where love doesn't smell of guilt. But what she never knew, is that the first clue that led me to this whole truth was right under our noses. A detail so small that she would never have imagined it would be the trigger for her downfall. Something she gave me herself, without knowing it. Something that now, looking back, still makes me smile. Because it was exactly this small detail that gave me the power to end everything, in the most devastating way possible. And maybe, if she had known what it was, she would have thought twice before leaving that receipt on the table. Welcome to the channel where love is real, but betrayal takes its toll. Here, we do not support any type of infidelity. The stories you will hear are fictitious, but inspired by the harsh reality of those who have felt the ground disappear beneath their feet. Our objective is clear, to show how betrayal can destroy lives, homes and hearts, and how, sometimes, justice comes from where you least expect it. Get ready to dive into an intense plot, full of twists, secrets and irreversible consequences. Good story. And be careful, this one will mess with you. In a house with large windows and light walls, in a neighborhood where the days pass with an almost rehearsed tranquility, lived a couple who, in the eyes of the world, represented everything expected of a successful marriage. Daniel and Laura had been together for 15 years. They married young, still driven by the passionate certainties that only youth offers, and built a life on the foundations they considered solid: respect, companionship, joint plans and a shared vision of the future. He was an architect, recognized for the perfectionism with which he drew each line of his projects. She, an artist, had her studio on the top floor of the house and sold her paintings in local galleries, enchanting buyers with her intense lines and melancholic colors. Together, they seemed harmonious even in their contrasts. He was rational, she was intuitive. While he organized the days with almost mathematical precision, she fluctuated between hours, letting herself be guided by inspiration and feelings that arose without a specific time. Their relationship was marked by an almost palpable mutual admiration. Daniel used to say that Laura was the heart of the house. She was the one who filled the spaces with life, with spontaneous laughter, with the aromas of handmade candles and soft music that echoed through the house at dusk. Laura, in turn, saw Daniel as a pillar. The man who always knew how to calm her, give direction to her scattered ideas, support her on days of insecurity and make her feel like she was exactly where she should be. They had their rituals, breakfast together on Sundays, the sweet notes left on the bathroom mirror, the spontaneous mid-year trips to somewhere they could disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. When friends saw them together, they often commented on how they still looked like they were in love. And in suits, on many occasions, they still were. They had a son, Lucas, aged 12, who studied at a private school and spent much of his time involved in extracurricular activities. Laura was always closer to the boy, taking him to theater rehearsals, helping with homework, actively participating in school meetings. Daniel, even though he was present, was more reserved. His way of showing affection was silent, more practical, less effusive. He believed that love was in actions, in bills paid on time, in windows fixed before they broke, in the way he always left the car's tank full so that Laura never had to worry. She, on the other hand, sought words, touch, emotional gestures. But they both found a balance, or at least they believed so. As with any long-term relationship, there were phases. Some months are warmer, others are more intense. Silences that lasted a long time, but always ended up being broken with some gesture of reconciliation. The couple's daily life was comfortable. They had a regular maid who helped them around the house, a quiet neighborhood, frequent friends at Friday dinner and plans to expand their home. Laura dreamed of a new, brighter studio, where she could explore a new artistic phase that was beginning to form within her. Daniel had even designed the first ideas, always willing to make his wife's dreams come true. At night, lying side by side, they talked about the future, about when Lucas entered high school, about that trip to Tuscany that they hadn't yet taken. There was complicity, even if, at times, it was too silent. And there was, above all, a tacit agreement that they were together for whatever it was. That's how Laura liked to think, no matter what life brought, they would face it together. In recent months, however, something had subtly changed. Nothing blatant. Nothing to cause alarm. Just an uncomfortable sensation that appeared in almost imperceptible gaps. Daniel was more introspective. He said he was under pressure with a large project, a contract with foreign investors that required long online meetings and almost impossible deliveries. He spent more time out, worked late, but when he was at home, he made a point of maintaining his habits, of sitting at the table, of asking how Laura and Lucas' day had been. She, on the other hand, began to feel a strange restlessness, a type of anxiety that she couldn't name. She felt dissatisfied with her paintings, as if nothing she produced was worthy of being on someone's wall. I would spend hours in the studio and leave frustrated, covered in paint but empty inside. He thought he was just going through a bad phase, perhaps a reflection of the monotony that had been growing between them. There were no fights, there were no screams, but there were also no longer those long looks, those distracted touches, the spontaneity that once brought them together. The nights became quieter. Laura began to drink wine alone while waiting for Daniel, who often arrived after 10. Lucas was already asleep, the house was dark, and she wondered if everything was still normal. He tried to convince himself that he did. After all, that's what happened in long marriages. Passion became partnership, excitement gave way to comfort. There was nothing to complain about. He was still kind. He still remembered her birthdays, he still bought her the wines she liked, he still put his hand on her back when they walked together in the supermarket. But it was as if all of this had lost its warmth, as if they were repeating movements without the soul behind them. She talked about this with a friend, who reassured her by saying that all couples go through phases like this. That perhaps it was time to reinvent the routine, to propose new activities together, to rescue what brought them together in the beginning. Laura tried. He proposed different dinners, weekend getaways, even a tango course. Daniel accepted, but with a tired expression in his eyes. He would smile, say it was a great idea, but put it off, always with the excuse that the work was too busy. Laura began to feel alone in her own home. Not abandoned, not ignored, just invisible. I spent hours reviewing old photos, remembering how he looked at her in her early years, how he bragged about her to his friends, how he seemed enchanted by every detail of her. And then came the invitations to exhibitions. Laura was asked to participate in a collective of contemporary artists, an event that would bring visibility to her career, but that would require travel, meetings with curators and long conversations about modern art. Daniel supported her, said he was proud. He encouraged him to accept. And she, for the first time in years, felt a new kind of freedom. She felt desired professionally. Admired by strangers who didn't just see her as someone's wife, but the artist that she was. She started going out more, dressing more intentionally, looking in the mirror with curiosity and not just to adjust her hair. It was as if he was rediscovering parts of himself that had fallen asleep in the comfort of routine. Daniel noticed. He said she looked more alive. And she smiled with gratitude, but also with a certain bewilderment, like someone who knows there is something growing there and doesn't yet know how to name it. Lucas, in the midst of it all, continued to grow with the lightness of someone who still doesn't understand the silences of adults. He was a sensitive, creative boy, enchanted by theater and music. He watched his mother with admiration and looked to his father as a model of responsibility. I still didn't notice the small misalignments, the long pauses in conversations at the table, the lost looks that sometimes crossed the air and died before finding a response. For him, his parents were fine. And maybe, in a way, they still were. What no one saw, not even Laura, was the discreet rift that was beginning to grow between the two. There was no one to blame. There was no error. It was just time, life, the accumulations of small, unspoken disappointments. It was the distance that begins without noise, but one day proves unbearable. It was the space that opens up between two people when one of them starts expecting something more, and the other doesn't notice. And it was precisely in this space that, without knowing it, Laura walked. An unknown territory, full of possibilities, where the new and the dangerous mixed in ways that are still undefined. And it was there, in that subtle terrain, that the story about to happen began to take shape. No fuss. No warnings. Only with the silent strength of everything that, once planted, is destined to germinate. The routine was discreetly rearranged, almost imperceptible to those observing from the outside. Daniel, increasingly involved in professional commitments that required constant travel and nights at the office, began to be away more than he would have liked. Laura, in turn, immersed herself with increasing intensity in the artistic world that unfolded before her. Exhibitions became frequent, invitations became more prestigious, and his name, previously limited to local galleries, began to circulate among influential curators. The professional excitement was accompanied by a new, bittersweet feeling, the rediscovery of herself. She felt admired not for being a wife or a mother, but for being an artist, for being her. Every attentive look at his works, every genuine compliment, seemed to warm a forgotten part of his being. It was at one of these exhibitions that he met Enrique, a collector and sponsor known for investing in emerging talents. He was an elegant, soft-spoken man with eyes that always seemed to measure more than they said. He approached Laura with a subtle interest, first in the works, then in the artist behind them. He listened to her with rare attention, asked questions about her inspirations, commented on the brushstrokes, the contrasts, what he saw beyond the form. Laura, accustomed to superficial glances and generic comments about aesthetics, found herself captivated by that attentive presence. It wasn't just the way he spoke, but how he made her feel, alive, interesting, intense. They started exchanging messages, talking at length after the openings, and, without her realizing it, Enrique was already a constant part of her days. There were no plans, nor promises. Just a moment, a meeting postponed for weeks, filled with tension and implied words. Laura was nervous. I was aware of the line I was about to cross. But at the same time, she felt taken by an irresistible force, as if something inside her demanded it. Enrique's touch was delicate, respectful, but not hesitant. He knew what he was doing. And even though she was divided, she gave herself up. That night, between unfamiliar sheets and promises that were never said, Laura experienced a confusion of emotions that would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't just desire. It was the feeling of having been seen, touched, validated as a woman. Something she hadn't noticed for a long time, but whose absence now became unbearable. In the days that followed, Laura was plunged into guilt. She looked at Daniel and felt small. He hadn't changed. He remained kind, careful, present in the details. And perhaps that was precisely why it hurt so much. The guilt didn't come from the betrayal itself, but from what she said about herself, about the lack she was trying to fill. He thought about stopping, about cutting everything off. But he couldn't. Enrique was not just an escape, he was a mirror, a catalyst for a much larger crisis. They became discreet lovers. They didn't see each other often, but an exchange of messages, a late call, a glance during an event was enough to rekindle what existed between them. Daniel, on the other hand, said nothing. He seemed too absorbed in his own world, immersed in projects, in meetings that seemed to multiply. But there was a silent restlessness about him, a diverted attention that no one saw. He began to notice changes in Laura. Small but significant. The way he took so long in the shower. The outings they once shared and that she now avoided with vague excuses. The way she smiled at her cell phone, how she put the device away in a hurry when he entered the room. Daniel was not suspicious by nature. But the details began to accumulate like pieces of an unsettling puzzle. He didn't say anything. He just watched. And the more I watched, the more I felt a distance growing between them, not physical, but emotional. An invisible wall that separated them, built with bricks of silence and muffled gestures. Laura, although guilty, continued her relationship with Enrique. He was the opposite of Daniel, impulsive, provocative, always ready to question what she felt, what she wanted. With him, Laura felt challenged. I felt fear and excitement. There was no comfort zone. And, as strange as it seemed, it attracted her. With Daniel, there was stability. With Enrique, there was risk. And between these two worlds, Laura oscillated, without the courage to break away from either. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. He only knew that the old life was no longer enough for him, but that the new one was still too uncertain to become definitive. The marriage, little by little, began to show more visible cracks. The conversations became protocol. The touches became rare. The nights, previously divided into confidences, were now long pauses filled with screens and silence. Lucas, sensitive as he was, began to notice the change. I asked more often if everything was okay. Laura smiled and said yes. Daniel changed the subject. The house, once vibrant, now echoed low sounds, restrained footsteps, measured words. Still, everything seemed under control. The appearance of normality was efficiently maintained. Friday dinners, visits to grandparents, school meetings, everything continued its course, as if life insisted on denying what was becoming increasingly evident. It was on an ordinary afternoon, with clear skies and gentle wind, that the truth prevailed. Daniel returned from a work trip earlier than planned. The flight was brought forward due to a last-minute cancellation. He arrived home silently. He didn't want to announce it, he wanted to surprise it. He brought flowers. He was bringing a gift bought in a small store in the center of the city where he had been, something Laura had always wanted. I thought about rekindling what I felt was fading away. I thought about inviting her to a weekend just for the two of them, away from everything, where they could talk and meet again. He walked lightly up the stairs, smiling as he imagined the surprise on her face. What he found, however, was the opposite. The studio door was ajar. And there, in the center of the room he himself had helped design, Laura was with another man. There was no kiss. There was no explicit gesture. But there was the look. And that, yes, said it all. It was a look he knew. It had already been directed at him. A look that isn't given to just anyone. A look of surrender, of intimacy, of something that doesn't happen overnight. Daniel froze for a moment. Then he retreated. He went down the stairs. She left the flowers on the kitchen table. And he left the house without saying anything. That night, Laura looked for him. Called. Sent messages. He disguised his despair. He said he had missed you, that he wanted to talk. Daniel didn't respond. Spent the night out. He drove aimlessly. He slept in the car. The next morning, it was different. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for explanations. Just watched. And there, a new game began. A silence full of intentions. A weight that she didn't understand, but that made her uncomfortable. Laura felt that something had changed. But he didn't know what. He began to live with a new burden, fear. Not Daniel's reaction, but what would come later. He was too calm. Too rational. And that terrified her. Enrique, in turn, continued with the same intensity. He didn't understand Laura's sudden distancing. He demanded explanations. She didn't talk. He felt like the castle he had built was about to collapse. And she was right. Because Daniel, now, observed everything with attentive eyes. And behind the silence, he plotted. He was no longer the deceived man. He was the man who planned it. That he knew more than he said. That was waiting for the right moment. It was on a sunny Saturday, during a family lunch, that Laura noticed. Daniel looked at her in a way she hadn't seen in a long time. A firm, direct look, without affection, but with something that made her freeze. And it was in that look that she understood, he knew. And the only doubt that remained was how far this knowledge went. The sun had already gone down behind the hills when Laura entered the house, her shoulders hunched, her steps hesitant, and her heart beating with the weight of something she still couldn't name. The living room table was set with disconcerting precision. There were 2 plates lined up, tall glasses, linen napkins, and a bottle of wine she hadn't seen since their wedding anniversary the year before. That didn't make sense. He felt a twinge of warning. He called out to Daniel, but his voice sounded weak, as if it had been muffled by the walls of the house. He received no response. She took a few more steps, her heels clicking on the floor like cracks in the silence, and found him on the back porch, sitting at the dark wooden table, wearing a shirt that she had bought herself months before. It was serene. Eerily serene. Beside him, a brown envelope rested on the table, closed with a red ribbon. He watched her approach with neutral, unwavering eyes, as if watching an already rehearsed scene. Laura tried to smile, a fragile attempt to regain some familiarity, but the gesture died before it could fully form. Daniel pointed to the chair in front of him. She sat up, her throat dry, her stomach churning. For a moment, he wished he were somewhere else, in another life. But there she was. And so does he. And silence was the only sound between the two. Daniel took the glass, swirled the wine elegantly and said with calculated calm that he had prepared this dinner because he believed they deserved an honest conversation. Laura didn't respond. He just lowered his eyes. The words seemed to escape, the justifications died before being born. I knew what he knew. He knew what he had done. But I didn't know what he was about to do. And that was terrifying. He began to speak in a firm voice without hesitation. He said that, for a while, he had felt something strange between them. Something that he couldn't name at first, but that slowly revealed itself, in minute details, in behaviors that didn't match the woman he knew. He said it was no longer possible to ignore it. Who tried to pretend out of love, out of fear, out of cowardice perhaps. But he couldn't do it anymore. Laura began to cry, her face red, her breathing ragged. He tried to explain himself, stammered fragments of regret, said he didn't know how things had gotten there. But Daniel raised his hand, asking for silence. And silence fell over her like a leaden veil. He then opened the envelope. He took from it an organized stack of documents, photos, and extracts. He said he had hired a financial crimes expert to investigate Henry. He explained that, upon noticing the pattern of transfers that Laura received into her account as supposed sponsorships, he decided to cross-reference the data with business and tax records. And what he found was much more than marital betrayal. It was a money laundering scheme involving overpriced works of art, fake international exhibitions, disguised transfers of cultural donations and deposits made by shell companies linked to the lover. Laura's eyes widened, her chin trembled, and tried to deny it, stammering that she didn't know anything, that she never touched illegal money, that Enrique had only offered artistic support. But Daniel was ready. He threw a copy of a statement on the table that bore her digital signature, authorizing the sending of paintings to a gallery in Lisbon that didn't even exist. And another, with the number of the bank account used as an intermediary in the name of Enrique's brother, already investigated for tax fraud. Laura's head swam. It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. Physical betrayal was now the least of the problems. She was involved, albeit unknowingly, in a federal crime. And he knew everything. All. Daniel stood up slowly, as if the moment required solemnity, and walked to the edge of the balcony. With his back turned to her, he said he was not seeking revenge. He said he spent nights thinking about whether to protect or expose. But deep down, there was no way to protect someone who destroyed so much without realizing it. That she crossed a line much deeper than a hotel room or an exchange of glances. That she allowed him to be made a fool of not just as a husband, but as a man, as a human being. That she tarnished the name of her own house, risked the future of everything they built. Laura stood up with a start, trying to get closer, begging for a chance to explain, to make amends. She was desperate, in shock, begging him not to hand over the documents to the authorities. To think of Lucas, to think of her. But Daniel turned slowly and with a hard, almost unfamiliar expression, replied that he had already thought. Very. Therefore, she would have until the end of the week to remove her things from the house. That he wouldn't make a fuss. That everything would be resolved with the same elegance with which she betrayed him. That the only condition was that she never try to use her son as a bargaining chip. Laura fell to her knees, her arms shaking, her face hidden in her hands. Everything seemed to crumble around him, but Daniel had already become impenetrable. Before walking away, he left a flash drive on the table. He said that there was enough evidence to incriminate Enrique and free her from part of the responsibility, if she decided to collaborate. But if he chose to protect his lover, he would also face the consequences. And then he left. No shouting, no drama. Like someone who no longer felt. Laura stood there, alone, surrounded by evidence, memories and rubble of a life that she herself had destroyed without realizing it. And for the first time in years, he felt afraid not of justice, but of the emptiness of someone who finally understood that they had lost everything that mattered most. Laura spent the morning sitting on the living room floor, her eyes fixed on a random spot on the wall while the house fell into a suffocating silence. The flash drive was still on the table, intact, like a silent bomb about to detonate the last bit of what was left of his dignity. He had cried until his body was exhausted, until there were no more tears, until his shame surpassed his despair. Everything around seemed frozen in time. The smell of wine in the air, the food laid out that no one touched, the distant sound of the clock ticking down the hours, it all sounded like mockery. In the morning, he got up not knowing if he had slept or just passed out. He walked to the bathroom and looked at the mirror with the same feeling as looking at a stranger. His face was swollen, his eyes were red, his hair was disheveled. She tried to tie her strands into a bun, splashed water on her face, but none of these actions changed the fact that she was about to experience the hardest day of her life. I knew that Enrique still didn't know anything. Not from what Daniel had discovered, not from the impending collapse. He probably went about his life with his usual arrogance, believing that everything would remain under his control. Laura knew she needed to act, but each step seemed more difficult than the last. He dressed in the first clothes he found, dark pants and a simple blouse, as if trying to erase any trace of vanity. He left home late in the morning, driving silently through the streets, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. She arrived at Enrique's office without warning, went up in the elevator with her heart racing, and entered without waiting to be announced. He was alone in the room, finishing a call. He smiled when he saw her, but the smile was short-lived. It was enough to look at his face to realize that something was out of place. Laura closed the door behind her and said they needed to talk. There was no more sweetness in his voice, no more hesitation. Enrique adjusted himself in his chair, asking if something had happened, and she was direct. He said that Daniel knew. That he not only knew about the case, but that he had discovered everything about the transfers, the documents, the false galleries. Henry turned pale. He tried to hide it, let out a brief, nervous laugh, said that this was impossible, that Daniel was bluffing. But her tone left no room for doubt. There was no accusation in Laura's eyes, just tiredness. A tiredness that bordered on the end of everything. Enrique got up, started walking around the room, tried to construct an explanation, but the words came in disarray. He spoke of political persecution, of an accounting misunderstanding, but he was interrupted when Laura took a copy of the digital declaration from her bag that she had unknowingly signed. She stared at him and asked why. Not because he had gotten involved with her, that, somehow, no longer mattered, but because he had placed her at the center of something so dirty, so dangerous. Enrique hesitated for a moment, then approached, held her arms with a firmness that was not tenderness, and said that he never saw her as an accomplice, but as a shield. That he never imagined Daniel would find out. That she was perfect for the role, a respected artist, a mother, a woman without blemishes. That it was enough to keep up appearances, sign where he asked, continue with his works while the rest was taken care of by others. Laura pulled away abruptly, as if that touch burned her. He then realized that there was never love there. There was admiration, perhaps desire, but most of all, there was manipulation. She was nothing more than a piece in a game much bigger than she imagined. Henry changed his tone. He tried to convince her to run away with him. He said that if she handed over the flash drive, they could both get rid of it together, erase their tracks, rebuild their lives somewhere else. He promised her protection, assured her he still loved her. But Laura just lowered her eyes, took the copy of the documents and left without answering. In the elevator, his breathing was uneven. The body trembled. It was as if every word Henry said was a confirmation of the ruin that had taken place. As he left the building, he felt the heavy air and the sunlight hurt his eyes. Everything seemed artificial. Everything seemed strange. She stopped at a cafe and sat there for almost an hour, trying to understand how she had allowed everything to get to this point. When he got home, he found Lucas watching TV. He ran up to her, talked about a science project, about a presentation scheduled for next week. She smiled, hugged her son tightly, and said she would be there. But inside, fear grew. Fear of what would come next, fear of losing custody, fear of being exposed. He went up to his room, turned on the computer and inserted the flash drive. He analyzed every file, every photo, every receipt. Daniel had done an impeccable job. There were dates, names, values, cross-references of information that not even she, even if she wanted to, could dispute. At the end of the reading, he just leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. I knew it was just a matter of time now. Divorce was right. The public exhibition too. But there was something worse, Lucas's look. The look that would inevitably change one day when he discovered who his mother really was. The next day, Laura scheduled a meeting with her lawyer. He wanted to understand the consequences, to know what chances he had of preserving at least his son's integrity. In the office, he explained the entire situation, handed over the documents, explained the connection with Enrique, and awaited the analysis with an expressionless face. The lawyer was honest. He said that she could still collaborate with the investigations, but that her name was already included in at least 2 preliminary reports. That time was playing against her. The sooner he took a stance, the better. Laura agreed. He said he would do whatever was necessary. Not for her. But for Lucas. It was the only thing that could still be saved. In the following days, she handed everything over to the responsible prosecutor, gave statements, showed how she was used without knowing, and detailed how she had been convinced to sign papers without reading them. He did not plead innocence. He asked for understanding. Daniel, in turn, kept his distance. He knew her every move, but he didn't interfere. He followed legal actions with the coolness of someone who no longer expects anything. However, behind that facade of indifference, something was beginning to emerge. Something unexpected. A woman had appeared in his life. Nothing planned, nothing sought. She was one of the partners at one of the architecture partner offices with whom I had been working for months. Clara, her name. She was neither exuberant nor effusive. He had an almost contagious tranquility. And Daniel felt good next to her. There was no need to feign strength or hide pain. With her, it could just be. The conversations were long, about everything and nothing. And one late afternoon, when Clara asked about their separation, he told her. No fuss, no flourishes. And she just listened. Without judging. Without interrupting. Just listened. And that was enough. A month later, Laura was called to court again. This time, as a formal witness. He had contributed decisive information that led to Enrique's arrest and the closure of 3 shell companies. She was still being investigated, but her collaboration had a positive impact. Upon leaving the hearing, she was greeted by Daniel, who was there for legal reasons. For the first time since that night on the porch, they looked at each other for more than a few seconds. Laura tried to thank him, but he didn't allow it. He said that was just the right thing to do. And that she should do the same from now on. Laura nodded, swallowing her embarrassment, and walked away. In the following months, the separation was finalized. Laura left the house and rented a small apartment. Daniel had primary custody of Lucas, but allowed regular visits. At each meeting with her son, Laura tried to be the best version of herself, even though she knew she was still carrying the weight of the past. Little by little, life took a different shape. Daniel and Clara approached each other naturally. There was no fulminating passion, but there was peace. And for him, after all, that was love enough. And then, one ordinary morning, when everything seemed to have finally found its place, Laura received a simple white envelope, with no return address. Inside it, just a photo. It was her, hugging Enrique, in the studio. The date was 2 years earlier. On the back, a single handwritten sentence, "There is always more to lose." And in that instant, she realized that the story wasn't over yet. Laura stared at the photograph in her hands for longer than she should have, trying to decipher the handwriting that spread across the back like a subtle poison. There is always more to lose. The threat was implicit, and what terrified her most was not knowing how far it extended, who else was involved, what could still come to light. It was no longer just the fear of being judged, it was the certainty that I had entered a game where the rules changed with each move. The image was not new. She recognized the moment. She remembered laughing just before the click was taken, at Enrique's hands wrapping securely around her waist, at the way he whispered something in her ear that made her smile without thinking. At that time, he felt special. Today, that same moment seemed like a trap frozen in time, about to implode everything she was still trying to rebuild. In the following weeks, life continued between remnants of routine and a constant feeling of vigilance. Laura began to notice small signs that made her uneasy, anonymous messages that appeared on her cell phone, calls that dropped at the first ring, envelopes placed under the door of her apartment with news of similar scandals, as if someone wanted to constantly remind her that her story was far from forgotten. He tried to remain calm, but the weight of uncertainty grew like a silent tumor. At each meeting with the lawyer, a new legal question arose, a new requirement from the public prosecutor's office, a new call for clarification. The process had not yet ended and his freedom was conditional on his full collaboration. Any deviation, no matter how small, could take her to a destination she would rather not even imagine. Lucas started asking more direct questions. He wanted to understand why his father avoided talking about his mother, why he now lived elsewhere, why there were days when he seemed so sad, even though he said everything was fine. Laura tried to balance her words, hide the pain, protect the boy from a truth that could break him. But silence was also violence, and she knew it. One afternoon, while painting a painting that he hadn't been able to finish for months, Lucas entered the room with a notebook in his hands. He said he had written a school paper on truth and consequence, and wanted to know if she wanted to hear it. The text was simple, but filled with a disconcerting sensitivity. It talked about choices, about regrets, about how sometimes we hurt the ones we love most without realizing it. Laura listened in silence, her eyes teary, and when he finished, she just said that she was very proud of him. He couldn't say more. The lump in my throat was too big. On the other side, Daniel experienced an opposite process. After months of pent-up pain, resentment, and vigilance, I was beginning to feel a kind of peace. It wasn't happiness, not yet. But a clarity that helped him rearrange the pieces of what had been broken. Clara became a constant presence, not only in her life, but also in Lucas's. The two had gotten closer naturally, without forcing any bond. Clara was patient, she knew her place, she knew she couldn't, and didn't want to, replace anyone. But his presence brought lightness. With her, Daniel relearned to laugh without guilt, to make plans without fear, to trust that it was possible to love again without the shadow of the past always threatening behind. Still, there were times when I hesitated. Especially when he remembered Laura not as the woman who betrayed him, but as the companion with whom he shared half his life. The memories, however painful, still had deep roots. The photograph Laura received ended up being shared with her lawyer. He advised that she be taken to the authorities as a possible attempt at intimidation. The problem was that, by doing so, she would put Enrique in the spotlight again, and he had already been arrested. The prosecution believed that there were more people involved, perhaps even someone from the artistic world who helped mask the financial operations. This caused the focus on Laura to increase. The police started monitoring his steps, his emails, his calls. Any mistake, no matter how small, could land her in hot water. The moral dilemma was growing within her, to remain silent and protect her image with her son or to surrender all possible connections, even if that meant exposing more lies, more secrets, and perhaps even harming people who knew nothing. In the midst of all this, a name emerged. A well-known gallery owner, a charismatic, influential woman, who had direct links with Enrique and, supposedly, was one of those responsible for validating the works involved in the schemes. Laura knew this woman. They had worked together, they had exchanged confidences about the cruel world of art, they had even shared nights of wine and frank conversation. Knowing that this person might be part of everything made something snap inside her. It was no longer a story about personal mistakes. It was a network. A tangled web that had built itself under his eyes. And what's worse, on some level, she always suspected something was wrong, but chose not to see it. She chose to be dazzled by the attention, by the recognition, by the desire to feel alive again. As the investigations deepened, Daniel was called to testify. Not as a defendant, nor as an accomplice, but as a witness. The prosecutor wanted to understand the extent to which he knew about his wife's financial transactions, the extent to which he had collaborated, and what he witnessed. Daniel responded honestly. He said that, for a long time, he lived in a marriage based on trust. Who never questioned Laura's artistic movements because he believed in her integrity. But he also said that when the signs began to emerge, he took steps to uncover the truth, and that was what saved his own integrity. The words were recorded, analyzed, archived. And he left the room with the certainty that he was doing the right thing. But with an emptiness in my chest that I couldn't explain. Because there, in that courtroom, he realized how much he still cared. Not out of desire, not out of romantic love. But out of respect for what they once had, what they built together, for their son who now lived between two worlds. The following night, Clara found Daniel sitting on the porch with his eyes lost in the sky. She sat next to him without saying anything. He told about the testimony, about the questions, about the memories that resurfaced. She listened to him calmly, held his hand and said that no one leaves a shared life unscathed. That the marks remain, even when the love leaves. And that sometimes forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, but about accepting that it happened and deciding to move on anyway. Daniel didn't respond. He just squeezed her hand tightly. That was the first time someone understood him without needing explanations. Laura, in turn, spent more and more time alone. He avoided commitments, refused invitations, distanced himself from former colleagues. The art no longer flowed. The studio remained closed, the brushes were dry, the canvases were blank. It was as if the weight of guilt had infiltrated his creativity, draining everything. Some nights, she walked around the apartment like a shadow, reviewing old photos, rereading old messages from Daniel, trying to understand at what point she lost herself. The past seemed more alive than ever. The pain was no longer just about the loss of the marriage, nor about the public exposure. It was an existential pain, a kind of mourning for who she once was. And for the first time, he started thinking about rebuilding. Not to win Daniel back, nor to prove something to the world. But so that, at least, Lucas would be proud to say he was her son. The process was nearing its end. And everyone knew that the decisions made in the coming weeks would change everything. The public ministry demanded more names, more evidence. Daniel, even outside the eye of the hurricane, was beginning to consider something unthinkable, testifying on Laura's behalf. Not to absolve her. But because he believed she had been used. That his guilt was serious, but not solitary. And that maybe, just maybe, she deserved a chance to start over. I still didn't know if I would do that. He was torn between a sense of justice and the desire to completely free himself from that story. But the doubt, in itself, already showed how much everything still hurt. Because even after the betrayal, the scandal, the pain, there was still a bond. A bond that did not break with the signing of the divorce, nor with the statements, nor with the documents. And it was this bond that made everything more difficult. And more human. It was a cloudy morning when Laura received the final call for the hearing to close the case. The envelope arrived without ceremony, left by the concierge, with the coat of arms of justice in the upper left corner and a date that already seemed to weigh on his chest like concrete. It was only 2 weeks old. 14 days to deliver the rest of the information he had promised, or all previous efforts would be considered insufficient. The prosecutor had been clear, full collaboration or the implications thereof could change drastically. I knew that, at that point, no decision would be painless. Handing over the remaining names would imply compromising colleagues, curators, artists who, like her, perhaps were just reproducing a dirty system without full awareness of its consequences. But not doing so meant betraying her son again, perpetuating the shadow of distrust over herself and proving right to those who still hoped to see her fall for good. Daniel, in his own way, also experienced his own conflicts. That same morning, I was walking alongside Clara through a wooded park, in one of those charged silences that precede important decisions. Clara knew that something was troubling him. Since the day of the testimony, Daniel has oscillated between relief and a kind of silent restlessness, like someone who knows there is something to be done, but has not yet found the right way to do it. When they stopped in front of a lake, he finally spoke, his voice low, almost in a confessional tone. He said he had considered writing a letter to the judge handling Laura's case. Not to defend her, but to declare that, although hurt by everything he had experienced, he recognized that she was used. That it was wrong, yes, but that it was manipulated in a moment of fragility. Clara just nodded. There was no jealousy, no resistance. She understood. It was not about unfinished love, but about conscience. A man like Daniel could not move forward with moral issues eating away at his peace. He needed to put a dignified end to the story, and perhaps by doing so he could actually make room for a new one. Meanwhile, Laura spent her days reviewing old papers, crossing dates, accessing files saved in forgotten folders on the computer. Each discovery was accompanied by uncomfortable memories, conversations that sounded harmless at the time, but now carried the perverse clarity of manipulation. He remembered a particular dinner, organized by Enrique, at which 3 of the names that now appeared on research spreadsheets were present. He remembered the smiles, the gifts, the promises of international exhibitions. Everything looked legitimate, professional, even glamorous. And yet behind every praise of his works there was a calculation, a darker, lower purpose. She felt disgusted with herself for having been so naive, for having accepted those opportunities without question. But more than that, I felt ashamed of having crossed a line that was now difficult to undo. Lucas had started asking about the process. Not directly, but in phrases that carried curiosity disguised as innocence. He wanted to know why his mother now spent so much time on papers, why she was always tired, why sometimes she got lost in the middle of sentences as if her mind was somewhere else. Laura tried to protect him from the answers, but realized that the boy already knew more than he was saying. He was observant. He noticed when his father arrived tense after the hearing, when the adults exchanged looks full of meaning, when the atmosphere changed at home even though the smiles remained. One night, while they were watching a movie together, he asked if one day it would all end. Laura was silent for a moment, then said yes, that she was doing everything she could to do so. He just nodded, laid his head on her shoulder and didn't bring up the subject again. With 4 days left until the hearing, Laura arranged a meeting with Daniel. I didn't know what to expect. I just felt like I needed to look into his eyes one last time before closing that cycle. They chose a discreet cafe, far from the usual places. When they sat facing each other, time seemed to hesitate for a few seconds. Daniel was serene, but there was something in his gaze that disconcerted her, a mixture of detachment and respect, as if they both recognized that they were once home to each other, but that now they were just traces of what once was. Laura was grateful for everything he had done, for the times he spared her, for the way he handled everything without publicly humiliating her, without retaliating with the same pain she caused. Daniel replied that he didn't do it for her, but for him. He said he needed to look in the mirror and not be ashamed of his own decisions. He said that deep down, he still hoped that Lucas would be proud of them both, even after everything. Laura then revealed that she would hand over the names. That he had already made the list and gathered the evidence. That I could no longer live with the weight of knowing and not acting. Daniel just nodded. He didn't congratulate her, nor did he console her. I just said that I hoped that, at the end of it all, she would find a place of peace. And maybe that gesture was the beginning of it. When they got up to leave, he held out his hand. She held it, and for an instant, their eyes met in a silence that said more than any words. There was no total forgiveness, but there was understanding. And that, at that point, was almost a miracle. The day before the hearing, Clara and Daniel had dinner together at home. It was a simple dinner, without candles, without ambient music, just the two of them and a sincerity that grew with each conversation. Clara asked if he was ready. He said no. Which maybe never was. That some things can't be overcome, they just reorganize themselves within us. But despite this, I felt I was on the right path. Clara smiled. He said he had more integrity than he realized. That it was unusual for someone to allow themselves so much moral discomfort just to maintain their dignity. Daniel laughed, shook his head and said that this was perhaps what most differentiated him from Enrique. He never needed to get dirty to prove he was strong. On the day of the hearing, Laura arrived at court early. She wore sober clothes, her hair tied up, and discreet makeup. Beside him, the lawyer carried the folder with the final documents. There were 3 new names, 2 galleries and a cultural institution involved in suspicious transfers. Cross-evidence, recovered emails, archived messages. All ready. Everything organized. When he entered the room, he felt the stares. She knew she would be judged, that many there saw her as an accomplice, as an opportunist. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth needed to be told. For the first time, he spoke without tremors. His voice was firm, paused. She explained every name, every connection, every memory that led her to notice the patterns. She was hard on herself. He did not hide his omission, his ignorance, nor the moments in which he chose to turn a blind eye. In the end, she apologized, not to the court, but to herself, for having allowed her lack to speak louder than her conscience. When she left, Daniel was waiting for her in the hallway. "I didn't say anything." He just gave a discreet nod of his head. Laura walked past him with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. For the first time in a long time, she felt clean. Still hurt, still rebuilding. But clean. On the sidewalk, he found Lucas with Clara. The boy ran to her and hugged her. She said that her father had explained that that was an important day and that she had been very brave. Laura held back tears. For the first time, perhaps he was becoming someone his son could look up to again. And, in that simple gesture, he understood that even after everything, there was still a way to go. There was still Floor. There was still redemption. But she also knew, deep down, that life doesn't offer new beginnings without cost. And that, somewhere, among the memories that still haunted her and the fears that still whispered in her ear, something was still waiting for her to be faced. Something that was not in the case records, nor in the courtrooms, but in the way she would deal with who she would become from that day on. ChatGPT said, time passed, not quickly, but necessary. The process ended definitively 3 months after the final hearing. Laura was exempt from formal punishment, but received a moral penalty that she would carry for much longer than any official conviction. His collaboration was considered vital to breaking one of the largest forgery and laundering networks in the country's artistic circuit. But the price was high, his reputation as an artist was irreparably damaged. Galleries stopped returning his messages, invitations to exhibitions ceased, the looks in the halls of the ancient cultural scene turned from admiration to silent judgment. She started working in a small improvised studio, in the back of a neighborhood bookstore, which agreed to exhibit her new works under a pseudonym. The paintings have changed. They no longer had the vibrant colors and soft shapes they used to have. Now they were rough, textured, marked by intense layers of superimposed dark paint. They were painful. But they were honest. And whoever saw them, even without knowing who had created them, felt that there was something deeply human about them. Laura didn't go back to who she was. But he allowed himself to become someone different, someone perhaps more real. She maintained joint custody of Lucas, but, in the first months, the relationship was carefully regulated by Daniel. There was an unspoken fear that the child would carry the cracks of everything that happened on his shoulders. But little by little, Lucas opened up to his mother again, rediscovering a side to her that he didn't understand before. They began to paint together on the afternoons they saw each other. Not to reproduce great works, but to create monsters, rockets, floating cities. Laura used this time to heal not only her relationship with her son, but with herself. He knew he would never erase the past, but he could teach Lucas, and himself, that even those who make serious mistakes can seek ways to rebuild. Forgiveness, she understood, was not an end point. It was a process, sometimes slow, always painful, but absolutely transformative. Daniel moved on. And he did so with the calm firmness of someone in no hurry. The relationship with Clara was consolidated, not as an escape from what he had experienced, but as a conscious step towards a new life. They weren't trying to look like a perfect couple. They had their differences, their moments of silence, their frank conversations about scars that were still open. But there was something beautiful in the way they treated each other. There was respect, there was space, there was listening. Clara didn't ask Daniel to erase the past, nor did she try to occupy the space that had been Laura's. And perhaps because of that, he admired her even more. He built something different with it, but not smaller. Something that was not born from impulse, but from choice. Lucas, over time, began to view her with affection. He just called her Clara, without confusing labels. But one night, after a quiet dinner, while she was helping him with a school project, he called her home. And even though she didn't realize what she said, Clara cried in silence when she went to the bathroom. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Enrique, in turn, was not so lucky. After Laura's collaboration and the expanded investigation, he was sentenced to a considerable sentence. He tried to appeal, he tried to deny, he tried to manipulate the system in the same way he did with people. But the data was too robust, the testimonies too firm, the network had already been dismantled. In prison, he lost everything he had built with the appearance of success. The name became synonymous with fraud, the assets were frozen, and the former partners drifted away like rats abandoning a drifting ship. A journalist even published an in-depth story about Enrique's fall, exploring not only the crimes, but the psychological profile of someone who used charm as a weapon and affection as currency. None of the victims wanted to appear publicly. But between the lines of the text, it was possible to recognize Laura's story. At the end of that year, Laura received an anonymous invitation to participate in a collective exhibition under the title, Survivors. The curator, who did not reveal her name until the last moment, explained that the event would bring together works by artists who had gone through deep personal crises and used art as a form of rescue. The rules were clear, no biographies would be shown. Only the paintings, without visible signature. Laura hesitated. He thought about refusing. But he decided to accept. Delivered 3 canvases. None of them had their usual palette. The 3 talked to each other like chapters of the same story, beginning, rupture, rebirth. On the opening day, she discreetly visited the gallery, mingling with the public like any other spectator. At one point, he heard a couple comment that this was the most intense sequence in the show, that there was palpable pain there, but also a kind of wordless redemption. She smiled. And for the first time in a long time, he felt proud of what he had done, and what he had become. Daniel and Clara were also there. They didn't know that Laura was taking part in the exhibition. They had been invited by mutual friends. They walked through the corridors, exchanging opinions about the works, when they stopped exactly in front of Laura's sequence. They were silent for a few minutes. Clara was the first to comment that those 3 paintings, together, seemed to tell the story of someone who fell badly, but refused to stay on the ground. Daniel agreed. And inside, I knew. There was no need to see the signature or confirm it with anyone. The intensity of the first painting, the chaos of the second, the light scar of the last, it was her. He looked at Clara, who also seemed to understand. And the 2 walked forward, hand in hand, without saying anything, because they had already said everything they needed to each other. On the way out, Laura saw them. He almost called them, but didn't. He observed the 2 from a distance, the way they walked side by side, the naturalness of the gesture, the lack of rush. He smiled discreetly, not in sadness, but in acceptance. There was a time when this would have hurt more than I could bear. But now, it was just the result of everything that had been done, and undone, with the choices she herself had made. She returned home that night feeling that although the past was still with her, it was no longer dragging her. It was like a scar that, no matter how visible it was, no longer hurt. Just remembered. And deep down, everyone there, without even realizing it, had survived the collapse. Not unharmed. but whole enough to start over. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? How would you react in the character's shoes? And which part moved you the most? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our stories. And remember, here, we do not support any type of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but the wounds they represent are real and painful. Until next time.